I'm James Galbraith. Let me welcome you back to this second day of our conference on Can the Eurozone Be Saved? We have two panels this morning, and the conference will wind up at lunch with a keynote address. So this first panel this morning is intended to provide some perspective from the United States on parallels and distinctions between our experience and that in Europe. And I've asked Damon Silvers of the AFL-CIO to moderate the panel, and I will turn the floor over to you, Damon. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jeremi. Good morning. This panel is entitled American Views of Europe and European Lessons for America. We're very fortunate to have with us Michael Lind, the Policy Director of the Economic Growth Program of the New America Foundation, and I might add, on a personal note, one of America's leading public intellectuals. Jeremi Suri, who is the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership here at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Marshall Auerback, the director at the New Institute for New Economic Thinking, which is one of the co-sponsors of this event, and Heiner Flassbeck, the director of Flassbeck-Economics and a longtime advisor on economic matters to a variety of very important institutions in Europe. What we're going to try to do in this panel, I'm told by the panelists, is really take up a number of different themes in interaction between the United States and Europe and other federal systems. Look at what can Europe learn from the U.S. and around the world, other federal experiences in terms of structure. What do we make of the comparative experience, the comparative response to the crisis between the United States and Europe, the way that federalism actually functioned in the U.S. over the last 5 years, some of the issues we've talked about earlier, the approach to the banking crisis on a comparative basis, labor markets on a comparative basis, social insurance programs and transfers on a comparative basis. We're also going to hear about the question of how does the United States, in this crisis, how does the U.S. look at Europe? And we've had some conversation a bit yesterday on this subject, and we're going to hear some more about that from Jeremi. And finally, Heiner, I believe, is going to tell us a bit, sort of respond to all of this from the European perspective. And so with that, I'm going to turn, we'll do it more or less like yesterday, 12 to 15 minutes of presentation from each panelist. I'm hoping closer to 12 because we got a little jammed yesterday, I think, on a couple of occasions, and then a little back and forth, and then questions from the audience. With that, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Damon. There's a general consensus that it was a mistake to create the Eurozone as a monetary union without being part of a banking, fiscal, and transfer union. Therefore, just on purely abstract grounds, it might seem reasonable to move towards a more integrated European federalism with all of those features, and that the United States, among other federal states, might be a model for this. In the few minutes I have, I'm just going to make a few provocations rather than detailed arguments in the hope that we can stimulate some discussion both among the panelists and in the question period after our talk. My first provocation is that I think, while it's interesting to speculate about very deep further European federal integration, I just don't see the politics of this now or in the near future. In much of Europe, you have a backlash against the European Union. You have, I have been told, a danger that the European Parliament will be captured by anti-European forces. And the anti-European sentiment among electorates, even though it may not be enough to destroy the present structure, would seem to me, from my distance and my acknowledged limits as an observer, to forestall any really radical restructuring and deepening of Euro-federalism. So that's my first provocation. But let's set the politics of it aside and look at what a more federal Europe, or a Europe which was trying to devise some sort of system of fiscal union and transfer union, could learn from the example of the United States. And that my second provocation is that the lesson of U.S. experience since the beginning of the Great Recession is that counterproductive policy in a federal union can undercut otherwise worthwhile federal institutions. Now, in the United States, what worked the best, and continues to work to some degree, have been automatic stabilizers such as unemployment insurance, Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, particularly for those who've lost their jobs and lacked insurance. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and is the latest addition to this battery of social insurance and income maintenance programs, which work the best when they don't have to go through the bottleneck of legislative appropriations every time there's a crisis. That's why they're called automatic stabilizers. Nevertheless, we've seen their effectiveness impaired in the case of unemployment insurance extensions and food stamps by politics, by attempts from the right to cut these social insurance programs, or in some cases means-tested programs, at the very moment in which they're still necessary in a weak recovery or in the depths of the recession. So there you have an example. And it's worse where you have the necessity, as in the case of extensions of unemployment insurance, for legislative prolonging of things. So it's not truly automatic. When it comes to fiscal union, the United States initially went by the textbook in which the sovereign nation state, in this case one which has the world's reserve currency, can borrow at relatively low rates in order to bail out federal subunits, in this case the states, which have real constraints on their borrowing ability, and in the case of most American states have balanced budget amendments, at least with the exception of capital expenditures in some cases on municipal bonds. So initially the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act bailed out a lot of public services, fire, police, school systems. But once again, you see a sensible system being undermined by counterproductive policy, counterproductive austerity policy in this case. As has been remarked several times in the course of this conference, the initial federal stimulus was too small by 50%, according to Christina Romer of the White House economic advisors to the president. There was no subsequent large-scale stimulus. The stimulus peaked in 2009, went down in 2010 and 2011, and petered out in the first part of 2012. At the same time, the effect of the stimulus, and scholars disagree about the degree to which this was true, but the positive effects of the federal stimulus were undercut to a large degree by the contractionary policies pursued by the states, laying off public employees, and in some cases raising taxes, which in general you don't want to do in the midst of a quasi-depression, while you're also cutting spending. And there were 7 states in 2012 which actually cut taxes below their pre-crisis baseline, either on corporations or individuals, in the pursuit of economic development or ideology or whatever the motive was. But that required even deeper cuts than the balanced budget amendment of the states would have required as a result of the revenue shortfall during the Great Recession. So to compound the fact that the state contraction is undercutting the sensible but too small federal stimulus policy, you then had a federal government which for the past couple of years has been focused on premature fiscal consolidation rather than recovery and job creation and unemployment reduction. So we are experiencing the sequester, very crude across-the-board budget cuts, which came about as a result of the failure of what would have been another contractionary policy, a super committee, which would have, if had its recommendations been adopted, would have had the same or similar effects of too rapid fiscal consolidation, that is spending cuts and tax increases when the economy is still very weak. The Congressional Budget Office, a nonpartisan government agency, estimates that if the 2014 sequester cuts proceed without being modified by Congress on top of the ones that have already been enacted, 1.5% of U.S. GDP will have been shaved off unnecessarily, in my opinion, as a result of this austerity policy being pursued by the government, and not to be partisan, but particularly by one of the two parties, which has repeatedly shut down the government or threaten to do so or threaten to reduce America's borrowing authority by not lifting the debt ceiling unless there are deep, permanent cuts made in the very programs, discretionary spending, but also long-term Social Security and Medicare, which are the automatic stabilizers which you would want in future crises, not just in this one. So that's my second provocation. You can have a fairly sound system of a fiscal union and transfer union, but if your elites are hell-bent on austerity, that's not going to stop them. My final provocation is that I think we should, and here I think there's a parallel on both sides of the Atlantic between the US and Europe, and the premise on both sides, in my opinion, is that there's going to be a recovery. In other words, that this was a cyclical downturn, or maybe it was a financial crisis of the Latin American kind, of the sort we've seen in Japan and in Sweden and other places in the last generation. If you agree with the theory of George Soros that this was a 30-year super bubble, and that an essentially unsustainable pattern of global industrial production and trade and credit was assembled in Europe and Asia and North America and the rest of the world, and that system has collapsed, it doesn't mean that we're going to see the dictatorship or the proletariat or a return to agrarianism or anything that unrecognizable, but it does mean that we cannot expect the next 30 years or the next 50 years to resemble the last, in the same way that the period after the Great Depression, the world economy was radically different than it was before. So, and what that means is, if you drop the idea of recovery, what would you put in its place? And a number of people have suggested this. The alternative is reconstruction. So the task now is building a new system, which hopefully will be more sustainable and more equitable than the one from the 1970s and 80s all the way up until 2008. But in any event, as time goes on, the idea that we're going to recover to some kind of pre-2008 trend line and then everything will be back to normal, I would just leave you with that final provocation. The new normal is not going to resemble anything that we have experienced in most of our lifetimes. Thank you.
So I want to begin by thanking the organizers and my colleague, Jeremi Galbraith in particular. I very vividly remember the summer of 2012. I spent that summer in Europe, mostly in Munich and a few other parts of Europe. And I remember reading time and again in the American press how horrible European socialism was. And my children, who then were 7 and 8, when they would see the Herald Tribune or whatever I was reading online, they would ask me, Dad, how have we been in Europe for so long and we haven't seen socialism? Where is it? And I think that captures some of the contemporary American vision of Europe, especially around questions of healthcare for at least one party in the United States and for a significant group. Europe, as Europe, has for some, at least in our public political discourse, become the other. Edward Said and others have told us that for a long time Americans create others in the Middle East or others in Asia. To some extent, for many of our economic debates and fiscal debates in the last couple of years, Europe has become the other for at least one side of that debate, and even for moderates in some ways. And that is a striking phenomenon. It's the most obvious phenomenon, and it's the most obvious way in which Americans have perhaps learned the wrong lessons about Europe, because we all know in this room that Europe is far from socialism. So this is a false other. That said, I think what's striking today are the ways in which this particular public image runs against a number of policy streams in the United States that I think are going to end up being much more important than this public discourse. And I want to highlight 3 of them, again, for the purposes of provocation, but also because there are 3 that I study and know about, and so I'll talk about what I know about. The first is the notion of multilateralism. One of the big shifts that's occurred at the same time that Americans have been debating questions of austerity at home, treating Europe as an other in terms of discussions of health care, one other major transformation is that the United States has gone from a hyper-unilateralist position under the Bush administration to a much, much more multilateralist position, especially on things that involve non-intelligence activities, which is to say beyond drones and NSA activities, but involving questions of nation building, reconstruction, democratization, various other issues, and most significantly, nuclear nonproliferation. America's more multilateral position has actually increased the importance of, for Americans, a strong, unified, and active Europe. So at the same time that we are criticizing Europeans for being a poor example, we are in many ways strategically more dependent upon European help than we have been before. Take Iran as a great example. The success of the sanctions, if they've succeeded, could only be possible because of European cooperation, only because of European cooperation. Take Syria, for example, and the ways in which the chemical weapons are being dealt with there. This is a non-governmental operation that also involves a great deal of intergovernmental cooperation for many European states. And take America's relations with Russia and the importance that Europe plays in there. At the same time that Americans tend to criticize Europeans for their economic structure, there's a much greater, I think, acknowledged strategic interdependence across the Atlantic than there certainly was 4 to 8 years ago. This is evident within State Department discussions today, where people actually do talk about Europe as a strategic partner. It's interesting. They don't talk about Germany as a strategic partner. They talk about Europe as a strategic partner on these issues. And Britain, as always, plays a role as part of Europe, but also as an asterisk standing out of Europe at times. I think this multilateral element here actually runs against American pushes for austerity in Europe, because a more austere Europe, the same positions that Americans are pushing at home, would provide Europe with less of an ability to do the things we want Europe to do internationally for us. So there's a contradiction built in to the arguments for more austerity, but also more multilateralism. And I think that'll be very interesting to play out. My guess is that the multilateral argument will win out over the austerity argument in America's strategic position. Second issue that is related to this is the question of burden sharing, which has been an issue, of course, going back to the Kennedy administration, but has become much more of an issue now, as Americans look to Europeans to invest more, not just in security issues, but in development issues of different kinds. And the debate there, it seems to me, is over whether Europeans can be allowed or encouraged to use more of their resources in places like North Africa, Central Asia, the Middle East, and elsewhere, but at the same time to do it in ways that are compatible with American strategic aims in these regions and American, sometimes ideological aims as well. And I think this is where there's a lot of interesting work being done now that cuts into fiscal issues that is often not thought about in those terms. Questions of budgets for the United States and Europe with regard to developmental aid are questions now not simply about what we want to accomplish in a given country, but how we can partner to use a diminishing pool of resources in targeted ways in different areas. Discussions about Egypt and Pakistan now are very much discussions along these lines. I think there's a whole new area opening up in the world of development assistance for more European-American cooperation, and this also cuts against the very negative American view of many European domestic policies. Both of these points are really saying that there is a bifurcated American view, a criticism of what Europeans are doing internally, but a desire for Europeans to do more things that run against austerity externally at the same time, right? We want Europeans to cut at home, but increase their spending overseas. And that's a change in the relationship from where it was 20 to 30 years ago. I think perhaps, though, the most significant transformation is not occurring at the federal level, which is to say the Washington to Brussels level or even the Washington to Berlin level, but I think it's happening at the state-to-state level. I've been struck by the greater degree of cooperation that's occurring at the sub-state level, dealing with what in the 1970s many scholars called the common problems of modernity. Problems of urban management, problems of environmental management. It's quite common now for these partnerships to be occurring below the level of federal, sometimes in spite of federal opposition in the United States. And I think it's a case where much of the language and discussion from the Cold War is relevant to us, because the relationships that were built up, the partnerships that were developed, the connections, might I even say the values that were exchanged by figures like Henry Kissinger and others, through groups like the Bilderberg, through union activities, through various institutions. I think these institutions have moved into the space that national governments have left. and that they are playing a key role in the relationship between the U.S. and Europe. I see this as a scholar. So many educational exchanges, so many of the things we do in sending our students overseas to study, they are happening at the subnational level. So at the same time that we're getting centralization of certain elements of policy, we're getting a decentralization of others. I think that's actually the strength of these two systems. And I think we will look back and say that on many of the key problems that we face today, immigration, education, democratization, inequality, and perhaps most significant of all, governance. That we will argue that the solutions did not come in a U.S.-European relationship or a U.S.-German or a U.S.-French or a U.S.-Italian relationship, but instead in a relationship of exchange between Texas and Bavaria, or between Massachusetts and a particular region of Italy, for example. That we will see these kinds of cooperative relationships playing a far greater importance. I see this in the way scholars talk about these issues, and I see this in the experience of many politicians. It's quite interesting, actually, to see how, on the one level, strategically for Americans, Europe is Europe. Europe is seen as more of a united entity. But I think in many of the economic and social issues that really matter, it's actually much more decentralized, much more fragmented in that sense. So that brings me to my final point, which is that I think the biggest challenge we face today is that the relationship has become more complex despite the simplistic rhetoric, and our citizens and politicians, particularly in the United States, are less educated and less prepared. One of the unique things about the post-World War II period was that Americans were hyper-educated about Europe. In the way they thought about their future, in the way they were trained as diplomats, in the way they thought about doing business. And that's not the case today. The United States has barely pivoted to Asia, but it has, in its consciousness, pivoted in significant ways. And so if there's a challenge, I really do think the challenge is not about being pro-Europe or anti-Europe or being pro-EU or anti-EU. It's about creating an intellectual foundation for the United States to deal with a complex and contradictory range of issues. An education that came naturally to a Henry Kissinger and a Zbigniew Brzezinski, and even a Condoleezza Rice to some extent, but does not come naturally to a Susan Rice or a Samantha Power or a Barack Obama. And I think that social transformation in the way Americans have come into the policy world and interact with it, I think that's the biggest challenge. And I hope that's something we'll talk more about. As I understand it, this conference is in a sense intended for that. And I hope it's something we can talk more about. I don't think the old models will work. I think we need to invent new models. I'll close with a story about my students in this context that I love to share. My students, more and more of them, my undergrads go and spend time in Europe. And in one year, my wife and I had the hardship duty of actually running one of the overseas studies programs at the University of Wisconsin and Michigan in Florence. I mean, this was a really hard thing to do, to spend time in Florence running one of these programs, living in Machiavelli's old house. But what I found was so many American students were coming over to Europe. And what were they doing? Spending time with other American students in Europe. Right? So we send our citizens abroad as Americans, but they're not actually really learning about Europe when they're there. This is different from the experience of those who went over to Europe in the World War II period and the immediate aftermath. That generation structured American policy through the end of the Cold War. A new generation that's making policy today doesn't have that repertoire of experience to draw on. I think that's more important than the ideological issues, and I hope that's something we can talk more about. Thank you.
See if I can fit this in here. Well, first of all, I want to thank my good friends Jamie Galbraith and Yanis Varoufakis for inviting me, Dean Hutchins, the LBJ School of Government, the University of Texas, Hook'em Horns. In one sense, it's a bit of a shame that I've been asked to come back here to discuss this topic, not because I don't love coming to Austin and seeing you all, but because it's basically the same topic over and over again. It seems that every couple of years the name of the country changes. One year it's Greece, the next year it's Ireland, then it's Portugal, Spain, Cyprus, and the beat goes on, to quote Sonny and Cher. So I was intrigued by the title of the panel that I was put on, American Views of Europe and European Lessons for America. In some ways, I feel very presumptuous giving American views on Europe because, as many of you know, even though I live in America, I am in fact Canadian. So I will put in a plug for some unique features of the Canadian Confederacy. Note, Stuart, Confederation, not Federation. So, you know, that was a magic word as far as I was concerned. We have, for example, a central bank that does lender of last resort functions, and we also have built-in equalization payments, which go on indefinitely from richer provinces to poorer provinces. So, you know, we in Ontario gave money to Newfoundland for about 40 years after Newfoundland joined the Confederation. So people in Greece, beware. Be aware of that, because it's not necessarily a bad feature of a federal or a confederacy. I will simply say that as far as the American views of Europe go, to the extent that it thinks of Europe at all, they don't think of it, I suspect, as eloquently as Jeremi put it. I suspect it's one of bafflement and incredulity. Now, I could stop there, but I still have another 13 minutes to go, so I'll continue. What I would say is that I think we have embraced the worst aspects of each other's polity in the last 20 or 30 years. A lot of bad lessons are being learned on both sides, rather than, I think, embracing many of the good lessons that we have learned from each other's blocks in history. Let me give you a few examples. Yves Leterme, I thought, gave a very good speech, and he talked about some of the progress that has been made within the European Union. But one of the things he spoke about, and you hear this spoken of all the time, are the quote-unquote labor market reforms. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever I hear the word labor market reforms, to me it's code word for helping to fire labor. I mean, basically, it's just it's hiring and firing workers. It's championing wage cuts. It's demolishing working conditions. It's abandoning job security. And I think in that respect, Germany has been a leader here, and I don't mean to beat up on Germany here. Certainly, it's not representative of the views of my esteemed colleague, Mr. Flassbeck. But I think that when you consider what has happened to the German Wirtschaft since the start of the so-called Hartz reforms, I think you'll get a sense of what I mean. Workers have got stuck with so-called mini-jobs. It's a new form of low-wage, part-time employment. These jobs, which were hailed as flexible in the US and efficient by their champions, detractors, I think, realistically noted that they were jobs, part-time jobs, characterized by heightened insecurity, lower wages, and poor working conditions. This is designed to help keep Germany competitive, to help this export model. This is apparently done on the basis that Germany produces great goods that the rest of the world wants to buy. Well, that's true, but it would be nice for the Germans to be able to consume their own economic output. They are the leading exporting nation in the EU, but they are driving down domestic wages, as Schroeder pointed out yesterday. And in the meantime, they're chastising their neighbors for their profligacy, but relying on those very nations living beyond their means to produce a trade surplus that allows their government to run smaller budget deficits and therefore feel very virtuous and lecture the rest of us. So, even though I think the vast majority of Germany's policymakers embrace this model, I think it's a losing situation in the long term for Germany's working class and its middle class. Because what's going to happen is that countries like Spain and Portugal have experienced significant internal devaluation. So when the next round of wage negotiations come up and the likes of IG Metall wants a raise, well, they'll be told by their bosses, well, you know what? Spain has become very, very competitive. Look what's happening to their export growth right now. And if you don't agree to these corresponding wage cuts, then we are going to relocate our factories to the newly competitive areas in, say, Barcelona. So that's what's likely to happen. You'll get more migration to lower cost areas. And of course, we've seen that going on for many, many years in the US. And in fact, this part-time job trend is actually being experienced in the US. If you look at the latest US household survey, it's now telling us that during most of this year, almost all of the increase in jobs have been in the part-time category, and it is reasonable to assume that these jobs are very low-paying service jobs. So I think this is exerting a big drag on personal income growth, and that's not being fully reflected in the official data. So what are the lessons we should be learning from each other? Well, I would argue, and I think Yanis has written very eloquently about this when he spoke about at the Kreisky lecture. During the 1960s and 70s, the Europeans created one of the most humane social welfare states created since the beginning of time. Unfortunately, for the past 25, 30 years, these wonderful institutions have been torn down gradually. American neoliberalism and the so-called Washington consensus seems to have infected the minds of most European policymakers. But frankly, I don't see how you can increase aggregate demand, collective spending power, whatever you want to call it, domestic consumption, if you've created a class of workers, 40 million to 60 million strong, who earn 2/3 less than the regulars, who have no entitlements or benefits, and who mostly live hand to mouth. I would say that the second half of the 20th century was remarkable in Europe in particular because most of the countries of this area were motivated and indeed able to create societies that were caring and equitable. And they were driven by a genuine concern for happiness and human welfare. And no, Norman, I'm not going to be talking about measuring happiness in an economic sense, but I think we all know what we mean. So, as I say, they have gone down in the opposite direction in the last 2 decades, and particularly over the last decade. Now, there is a way forward, and instead of presumptuously stating an American view through the mouth of a Canadian, let me cite the lessons of, let me quote 2 Americans and cite the lessons of 2 Americans, Henry Ford, and one of the hosts of this conference, my friend and mentor, the esteemed James K. Galbraith. First, I'll talk about Henry Ford, and by the way, I'm not associating them politically in any respect, in case you had that idea. But Ford, as you know, was no socialist, and I'm sure those of you who have studied him would realize that his politics veered somewhat towards the right, although he'd probably find a very comfortable home in today's Republican Party. But he did have one simple insight, which I think most modern-day economists would find abhorrent, which is that if you pay your workers a decent wage, lo and behold, they can buy your output. So in the 1920s, Henry Ford actually paid his workers $5 a day, which in those days was real money. And Ford didn't justify this largesse on the basis of some crazy socialist Marxist doctrine. He just simply pointed out that his workers could now afford to buy his cars, which they did, and a glorious industry took off in the United States. Now, let me quote what James Galbraith said to the German Trades Union Congress when he was discussing the great financial crisis of 2008. Jamie said the following: "What happened in the US, this is in 2008, was that we had a very flexible and effective system of public transfer payments which rose rapidly in the crisis. Unemployment insurance, early retirement under Social Security, disability, lower tax collections, and then on top of that, the expansion package, the stimulus package, the Keynesian policy that came into effect very, very quickly. These things broke the fall in incomes and preserved living standards to a substantial degree. Now, perhaps we did not recover, but we did not fall apart, which is what is in risk of happening over here. Why not? Because, as Jamie notes, fundamentally, we are working with national institutions that were built a long time ago in the New Deal and the Great Society, and fundamentally, those institutions are still there. We're gradually taking them apart, unfortunately, but they are still there. Deposit insurance, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and grant aid from the federal government to the states and cities. It's a tested model, and as Jamie points out, it works. Now, I think in the EU, I mean, frankly, short-term management solutions such as the EFSF, the ESM, the OMT, they do not negate the need for a coordinated fiscal policy to ensure the spatial pattern of aggregate demand is sufficient to avoid recession in all member states. Now, when European leaders are now talking about fiscal integration, more fiscal integration, they're doing so within a culture of austerity and very deep hostility from Germany and other rich nations such as the Netherlands and Finland towards any additional help for the, let's call them the Mediterranean countries. Monica, is that okay? No periphery? And the latest wheeze is the six-pack. Now, you all know about that. Now, look, I'll concede. I'm a vain person. I go to the gym. I go to the gym relentlessly to achieve that elusive six-pack. Some of my friends and my wife would certainly say I'm obsessive about it. I also confess that I like the odd beer now and then, as do my German friends. And I head to the supermarket once in a while to buy a six-pack or two, which probably explains why I'm not getting the six-pack from the gym. The point is I have a choice, okay? I can drink beer. I can go to the gym. It's not being forced on me. And it's certainly not being forced on me when I'm in a condition of needing massive recuperation. You know, I did one of these presentations on the Eurozone. I was speaking with Yanis, in fact, last November. And I opened my presentation with a clip from the film Misery. Some of you may have seen it. It was with Kathy Bates and James Caan. If you haven't seen the film, there's a scene in which, after taking in her all-time favorite author, Paul Sheldon, who's played by James Caan, and after a car accident, crazed fan Annie Wilkes, which is played by Kathy Bates, wants him to stay and rewrite his latest novel. It's very important to her that he not leave. So when she discovers that he's broken the rules and left his room, she tucks in a block between his ankles and takes out a sledgehammer and hobbles him. What follows is, it's very unpleasant. His ankle is flailing to one side after the first strike, and it's a very miserable sight. I mean, it's one of the more cringe-worthy things in cinema. But it's a perfect metaphor for what the ECB is doing today. So effectively, the ECB now has said, we're going to buy the bonds of the likes of Spain, Portugal, Italy. They've effectively now said, we're going to use our balance sheet to backstop the bonds, even though they say it's to ensure the proper functioning of the monetary transmission. But they are effectively dealing with the systemic crisis. But they are doing so in a way that hobbles the patient perpetually. I'll be done in 3 minutes, even less. So the issue really is that it's like, I'm a patient in a hospital and I'm fed a drip, and every time I get out of bed, my legs are broken, and so I can't really walk. And that's really what I think the latest wheeze, the six-pack, threatens to do. There's no choice here. It's a form of economic sadomasochism. And it reeks of a nasty, controlling Big Brother sort of world. And the problem is, as Terry Gibbons and Tom Ferguson pointed out yesterday, that people are getting wind of this abrogation of their democratic rights, but because they are not finding any reflection of their views in the mainstream parties, they are voting accordingly, so they are voting for parties of the extreme right. So I think we've had this discussion before, but it bears repeating again that fiscal stimulus should not be conditioned on austerity. Budget outcomes, in fact, should not be evaluated against meaningless fiscal rules, because, in fact, they are, as we can see, impossible to meet when a crisis is being experienced. In bad times, budget deficits rise. That's something else we learned from America. That's something else we learned from Europe. This is not a signal to impose pro-cyclical fiscal austerity. As we have seen, the attempt to drive fiscal policy on this basis, I think, is a non-starter. And I think, let me also make one final point in regard to debt restructuring before I leave it, because that's been discussed. I'm not neglecting that restructuring will be important at some point, but growth, as Gustav Horn pointed out yesterday, takes care of a lot of these problems. If you have this negative feedback loop whereby the sovereign's solvency continues to be questioned, the bonds deteriorate more, the bank's balance sheets deteriorate further, and you have an even bigger problem of debt. So I think you have to deal with the issue of growth first. And I will end with a plea to give one final lesson from history. I'm not quoting the Marshall Plan because of my name, but let me just say that even though I think Richard Parker is right and that the U.S. did not act from totally altruistic motives, and I think if any of you read Joseph Conrad's Nostromo, you should read it because it's an excellent novel, but he simply points out that human beings and governments operate from a very complex mixture of motives, so, but the outcomes can still be good. But the point is that the victorious Americans, when they won, they didn't preach austerity, despite the fact that Germany had clearly lived well beyond its means and it used up its real resources limits during the war. Even after that the devastation that had been wreaked on the world, the large-scale American program to aid Europe sought to build the German economy rather than destroy it. And I would hope that that sort of spirit can be revived to some extent amongst Europe's policy leadership today. So thank you very much.
Can I?
You're on.
Thank you.
And
And your fellow panelists have been so...
They were very disciplined. That's very good for me. That's
You've got
good for
15
me.
minutes.
That
You can
gives
have
me-
the full
It gives
15.
me another 2-3 minutes in addition. So I'm going to be very quick again and not going to thank anyone because I do not have the time for that. My first remark is on, because I have 2 different topics. At the end, I really want to answer that question. Up to now, nobody tried to answer that question, so I give you a definite answer on that. Can the Eurozone be saved? But let me first say something on Europe-America relationship. So can America learn something from Europe? Yes, a lot of things, but nothing related to our topic. Second, can Europe learn something from America? Yes, one important thing related to our topic. And that is, and we were in Brussels some time ago, I elaborated a bit on that, I do not have the time today. The monetary union turned Europe into something like America, namely into a big closed economy. There were small open economies before, but when we entered the monetary union, we transformed it into a big closed economy. And obviously, in a big closed economy, economic policy goes in a very different way than in small open economies. Because small open economies engage all the time in beggar-than-neighbor policies and try to get to flourish through increasing, growing exports and export surpluses and so on. A big closed economy cannot do that and shouldn't do it and shouldn't even try to do it. And this is what the Americans have learned over many years, and Europe has not. Europe has not understood. What Germany is now trying to do is turn everybody into Germany, make everybody to become German, and this will make things worse because it will then turn Europe into a whole continent that is trying to beggar their neighbors, and that will not work. And the warning shot from the American Treasury was right in time to maybe give them a wake-up call and tell them it doesn't work. It cannot work. Europe cannot produce the same kind of current account surplus as Germany has. Europe cannot beggar its neighbors in the way Germany did in the past. And Europe cannot have permanently positive contributions from trade. It's absolutely impossible. Positive contributions from trade are not there because the contributions from trade for GDP and growth are a zero-sum game globally. And if one guy has a positive contribution, the other one has a negative. And you cannot ask the rest of the world, Europe cannot ask the rest of the world to have all the time negative contributions from trade and itself having positive contributions. That's absolutely impossible. So this is a simple lesson that Europe has to learn. But now to my question, the main question. Can the Eurozone be saved? Simple answer, yes. Is it going to happen? No. Why is it not going to happen? Well, for a very simple reason, namely that France, I should say, unfortunately, I'm not talking about Greece. Greece is an important country, but not relevant for the euro crisis. We're talking too much about Greece, so I'm not going to talk about Greece, but I'm talking about France and Italy mainly. These are the important countries, and they will decide the fate of Europe. So why can is it very improbable that the Eurozone be saved? It's very simple, namely France and Italy cannot repeat what Spain, Portugal, and Greece have done. Simple like that. Let me show you a simple chart. Everybody's talking about Greece, but as I said, it's not relevant. Look at France and Germany, and you see this is nominal wages and nominal productivity per hour in euros. And you see at the beginning of the Eurozone, there was no problem at all. France and Germany were in absolute terms exactly at the same level in terms of productivity and of wages. And at the end now, France is still doing well in terms of the difference between productivity and wages. So profits are still okay in France. Productivity has risen exactly the same way as in Germany in real terms. This is nominal terms a bit more. The only thing that has happened is the prices have been increased in France more than in Germany. So it's a nominal problem due to a very simple fact, namely wages have been increased more in, let me first show you that. more in France than in Germany. So you have nominal wages and productivity, just to show you what the difference is. And you see, oh, it's in German, the title is in German, but it's nominal wages and productivity in Germany. Real productivity now. So you see productivity has increased a bit in Germany from 100 to 115. Nominal wages have increased a little bit more. But if you compare to France, you see that's a big difference. And the German title there says this is the error of Mr. Draghi. Why is the error of Mr. Draghi? Because Mr. Draghi presented this chart to the European Council and said, look, who's right and who's wrong? And his answer was, Germany's right and France is wrong. Unfortunately, that's wrong. The right answer is France is right and Germany's wrong. So, if you understand that, then the rest is very simple. Namely, and this is what I've shown here 2 years ago, it's exactly the same thing. What we had is we have a monetary union in Europe with an inflation target. Oh, everybody forgets about the inflation target. There was an inflation target. The inflation target is 2%, or 1.9 exactly. So everybody should adhere to the inflation target of 1.9%. And if you want to do that, you have to increase your wages more than productivity, because we have a very strong relationship between unit labor costs, so nominal wages minus productivity in principle, and inflation. So if you want to adhere to a monetary union and you want to be a good member, a member according to the spirit of the monetary union, you have to increase your wages more than productivity, your nominal wages more than productivity, exactly as France has done. So, and if you compare the increase of unit labor costs over time with the inflation target in Europe, you see that one country was right and the other one was wrong. And the country that was right was France. And the country that was wrong was Germany. Very simple. Germany has been living below its means all the time and is now accusing the others to live beyond their means. But for France, it's not true. France is the country that has exactly lived along its means, which means along the inflation target that everybody agreed on. And it was the German inflation target. It was not the inflation target falling from heaven. It was German inflation target that everybody accepted in the monetary union of something like 2%. And Germany, it was really realized by Germany before the monetary union, but when the monetary union started, suddenly it was no longer true. So, very simple story. Some countries tried to adjust. I give you two examples. This is Greece and Spain. They tried to adjust. So they cut their wages. It's very simple. What could you do? You cannot increase productivity in a short time. And you anyway have no investment, no flourishing economy, so productivity is out of the game. So what you do is you cut wages. You cut wages. And you see, Greece is very successful in cutting wages, Spain a little bit. But on the other hand, the way to reach the blue line there is quite far. So Greece has to go another 2-3 years with wage cuts of 20 to 30% to reach only Germany, to be at par with Germany, not to improve its competitiveness against Germany, but to reach the German level of competitiveness. So good luck with that. Spain is not yet there, but we all know what has happened. We all know what has happened in these two countries. We all know that in these two countries there was a dramatic adjustment, and Gustav has shown it yesterday, and others have talked about it yesterday. A dramatic adjustment, namely this wage cutting did not come without a cost. It came with a big cost, and the cost was unemployment. Oha! This is something new. This is against the mainstream theory, because the mainstream theory, and this is clearly what guided the Troika and others, would say if you cut wages, well, you bring unemployment down and not increase unemployment. Unfortunately, it's not true. It's not true. And if you look at some countries, look at Portugal, when they started the wage cuts, and there's wages are shown, real wages, there's real wages per hour on the right-hand scale, real wages per hour. Then you see that in two different definitions, one is from the producer side, other from the consumer side, deflated. You see when the wage cutting started, unemployment went up. Exactly at that time. And it was not only the fiscal consolidation, not the attempt only to bring down the government deficit, but it was the wage cuts that brought unemployment up. Because what is the immediate effect of a wage cut is a cut or a restriction in domestic demand. In all these countries, domestic demand is 75% and exports are 25%. So you're trying to improve 25% by killing 75%. Very reasonable strategy. And you look at the other countries, you see in Greece it's even worse. Exactly at the time when the wage cut started, unemployment went up. And the last country, Spain, the same thing. So if we now go back to our wonderful chart, that shows one terrible thing. Namely, 2 countries have not adjusted at all. 2 countries have not even tried to adjust to the German doctrine of becoming more competitive. And that's Italy and France. So what is going to happen if Italy and France do what Germany asked for, namely to cut their wages by 20%? Well, exactly the same thing as in the other countries. And now comes a simple political prediction. Do you believe, does anyone in this room believe that Europe as a whole and France and Italy will survive an increase of unemployment in France and Italy by 20% without being somehow transformed into a different thing? Because what would happen is absolutely clear. That is a very vital danger for democracy. If we do not give these countries a chance to reduce their unemployment, but even we produce more unemployment, and this is the only way out, obviously, according to the German doctrine, then democracies will not survive. That's for me absolutely clear. And as yesterday was said by Ferguson, it's a political question. It's a political question, but it's forced by an economic dogma and economic ideology. Because what we need, and this is, I'm coming to the end, the chairman is already looking at me. Yeah, okay, fine. So give me 5 minutes. The point is, and forget about all the rest, the discussions about debt and things and Greece, and as I said, the crucial question is very simple. Is there a chance for these countries, for Italy and France, to get out of the slump, to reduce their unemployment, to go back on the growth trajectory as they had before the crisis? And what would be the stimuli that they could use to do that? And so now go through it. Fiscal policy is not available, it's the other way around. Fiscal policy is restrictive and is asked to be restrictive in the future. Monetary policy is out of the game. Monetary policy tried everything, but as we said yesterday, someone said pushing on a string doesn't lead very far. Wages will be under pressure, so the income expectation of the people, as we said yesterday, are under dramatic pressure, so you cannot expect a revival of domestic demand. And exports are restrained by Germany. So where are you going? Nowhere. And this is the crucial point. This is a very simple point. If you go nowhere, if you don't have any chance, if politics in these countries, in Italy and Spain and France, have no chance to revive their economies, have no chance to stimulate demand, then they're going nowhere. They're going to right-wing governments in a couple of years. That's absolutely clear. What else should happen? So, and this is why, and they cannot go on like this, because if they go on like this, they're losing market shares all the time against Germany. They're losing more and more, because there is no wage increase in Germany that would close the gap at this moment of time, and there will be no in the next years. So they will lose anyway. So there's no way out. If they go on, they are lost. If they try to do what Germany asked, they are lost. So what is the outcome? It's very simple. Someone said it yesterday. If you don't give solutions, if you don't have political solutions, the end will be chaos and a solution that nobody wants. Thank you very much.
So the panel was admirably disciplined, and we have lots of time for discussion and questions, which is fabulous. I'd like to begin by asking the panel to focus on something that came up a number of times, but in each presentation, but it wasn't, I think, fully developed. And I think it was even though Heiner, I think, really focused on the core issues in Europe, his presentation is actually about this too, which is what is the real direction of U.S. policy in relation to the European economic crisis? What is it? I think there are two stories out there. And I'd be interested in what the panel thinks is which one is correct, or are they both correct, or are they both wrong? The first story was covered in the press in the last week or so, which is that the United States is a critic of European austerity, and the United States is a critic of Germany's beggar thy neighbor policies. This is the Jack Lew, this is the Treasury Department's statement that in the currency report that Germany is engaged in a destructive set of economic policies. I should just note that I'm a frequent monitor of that report in relation to China, which they can't seem to quite get around to noticing is manipulating its currency, and yet they've gotten around to finding that Germany's doing something wrong, which I find very interesting. But so, anyways, there's that point of view that the United States is a critic of European austerity. Then there is the point of view that I think that Jeremi kind of indicated, which is that the United States is not a critic of European austerity. In fact, that the United States is a promoter of it. And this is why I say Heiner's presentation seems to be in large part about this, that the United States is a promoter of policies of wage suppression. Yeah. Right? That the agenda that you put up and said is the German agenda was actually originally the United States' agenda and remains the U.S.'s agenda. So which is it? So which is it? What is the United States actually telling Europe, or are we telling Europe incoherent things?
Who do you want?
Well, I think there's a third aspect to U.S.-European relations that hasn't come up because it's not that immediately relevant to the Eurozone. That's the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which if you go to these meetings on both sides, as I have, is largely a geopolitical project designed to create a common regulatory base of the Atlantic economies in response to what is perceived as the regulatory and non-tariff barrier discrimination by China, but also by Brazil and India and other rising economies. Now, that fits in there in a kind of awkward way, because the policymakers in both the U.S. and in Europe have promised that TTIP will create significant jobs in both sides of the Atlantic by means of increasing exports to the other. So there's kind of a moment of reckoning at some point in the future where at least that rationale collides with reality. That is, if, as was observed earlier, if the goal of the Eurozone is even more exports as a whole to North America, then, and the Obama administration and Congress want the U.S. to run trade deficit surpluses with Europe, somebody's going to be disappointed.
Yeah. If I may, thank you very much, Damon, for this putting things in the right order. Indeed, I forgot to mention that in the U.S., the permanent claim from the U.S. on flexibility of flexibilizing the European labor market was always wrong and inconsistent. Always wrong and inconsistent. But it was widespread. It was even by Larry Summers, Paul Krugman, all had that as a permanent mantra. Europeans have to flexibilize their labor markets. What they never understood, and what they should now begin to understand, is that if you flexibilize the labor market, and Germany is a very clear example of that, what you get is if there's no retaliation through the exchange rate or through protectionism of your trading partners, you get a positive effect on the export side. But what you get and what Germany got is a negative effect on the domestic side. And that is not yet understood. It's not understood in Europe and neither in the United States. And now you have also depressed wages here. I said it 2 years ago in the last conference here. You have depressed wages in the United States, and that is the main reason why the recovery does not come in a normal way. That is why the desperate attempts of monetary policy fail to revive the economy in a normal way. And this is the common lesson that we have to learn, and the Americans should stop asking the Europeans to flexibilize their labor market and look at their own labor market and deflexibilize it a bit.
Yeah, so I think the two schools of thought that you posit are both correct, and it's where you have this internal-external view. There's a certain inconsistency, but there is a logic to it. I think most decision makers, especially foreign policy makers in the U.S., they want the Europeans to spend less at home, and they want them to spend more abroad. So it's a domestic austerity position, and it's an external expansionist position, and I think that's been heightened in the last couple of years.
It's funny. You wonder if those policymakers have heard of elections. Right. I mean, if you think about that particular demand.
Right.
Yeah, I have really nothing to add other than, that I think the question presupposes a certain coherence in American policymaking, which isn't always there, I think, to put it mildly. But the other point is, it's the old problem of the fallacy of composition. Until we start exporting our output to Mars and establish a Martian colony and start exporting it out there, then someone's going to be able to find an importer. Yeah. And clearly, both blocs have decided that they want to be the exporter, not the importer of last resort. So.
Just another small remark concerning China. In the G20, there was a long debate the last 3 years. I've been sitting in the G20 as an observer for UNCTAD, and there was always the debate among the US and China about exchange rates. The Chinese have not changed their exchange rate, but the Chinese have done something adequately and effective, namely they have increased their wages. In China, wages have increased, so the real exchange rate, the competitiveness of China, has dramatically suffered over the last year. The real exchange rate has appreciated, despite the fact that the nominal exchange rate is still at the level it was a couple of years ago. This, unfortunately, is not mentioned by the currency report of the Treasury. It's not clearly spelled out, although they take China a bit out of the focus and focus more on Germany. That's right, but they have forgotten to talk about wages in China, and again, that's consistent with the inconsistent point of view.
And I'll make one last quick point before you move on, which is that the reason why all these countries want to export is because they want to run large trade surpluses, because by accounting identity, if they do that, then they can run smaller fiscal deficits. And we are in the midst of this massive fiscal deficit hysteria across the world. Now, this loss of export competitiveness, or if you run a trade deficit, it's not a problem if you're happy to run a large fiscal deficit. And again, I've long contended that there's nothing wrong with running large fiscal deficits. It's in many respects far more stable to an economy to have large levels of public debt than private debt, and but that seems to be so out of the prevailing policy mainstream that it's never discussed.
So I'll ask one more question to the panel and then turn it over to the audience. I think several people, Heiner, I think, made this point about politics, about the necessity of organizing a solution. What can Europe learn from from U.S. politics around solutions to the economic crisis, both functional and dysfunctional? And B, what role? How would you think about if you're trying to organize the political foundations for a different economic approach in Europe? How would you think about the United States as an actor in that process, and then B, other important economies in the world as an actor in that process? China, for example. What are China's views, and how would they play into this? Or for example, other leading emerging market countries?
Well, it was tried, as I said, in G20 was tried the last 3 years. There were very intense debates about all these topics, but unfortunately without any conclusion and without any solution. Which in my view is due to the fact that, well, you see German stubbornness on their position, but also on the U.S. side, stubbornness on their position concerning the labor markets. What you need today is an intervention into the labor market. It doesn't work without intervention of the government into the labor market, because unions are too weak. You have unemployment that came without higher wages. The unemployment was just a result of the financial crisis, so we have a dysfunctional labor market, and we should talk about that every day. The dysfunctional labor market, namely, is putting pressure on wages that are anyway low. And this should not have happened. We have, after 2008, we have this dysfunctional labor market, and the government has to intervene to change it. This is a taboo in the United States, and as long as you keep that taboo...
You're describing the U.S. labor market now.
Yeah, U.S.
Right.
labor market, yeah. And but in Europe, it's now getting worse because of the thing that I've told you about the competitiveness. But you have to learn that lesson, and if you don't learn that lesson, we are all in trouble, because we cannot get out of the slump.
Well, I'll make the point. I profoundly agree with what Yanis Varoufakis has said many times, which is that...
That has to be wrong.
that you can't... it's unrealistic to move to a United States of Europe type of federal federation, and as Stuart Holland said yesterday, I don't think it's desirable. I think you have to work with the existing institutions within Europe. At this point, you think about the economic equivalent of triage. You can worry about the plastic long-term reconstructive surgery later. But the point is, what I suggested a few years ago was having, and Paul de Grauw has suggested this as well, was having the ECB effectively unilaterally guarantee they would backstop the bonds, and that effectively deals with the solvency crisis because you have the credibility of the issue of the currency behind it. And as we've seen now, I don't think that the OMT is a good policy, but I'm very struck by the fact that even the promise of the use of the European Central Bank's balance sheet has had a profound impact on the spreads and the bond yields of some of the suffering sovereign countries. So I don't agree with the conditionality that's been attached to it, but the point is that the markets at one level intuit that if you have the issue of the currency backstopping something, you deal with the systemic issue of solvency. Then you have to deal with the aggregate demand problem, and this is where I think the other component of the model's proposal comes into place. You have institutions, you have the European Investment Bank, which is allowed by treaty, as Yanis has pointed out many times, it can leverage up its balance sheet and be used to fund a number of infrastructure projects. So you have to have that growth component. And my feeling is you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Let's just use existing institutions and not try to recreate something or introduce some complicated treaty changes, which, as Yves Le Terme pointed out yesterday, is very, very difficult to do.
Yeah, I fully agree, but let me just say one sentence. I fully agree with that. But what we need in Europe is a fully open discussion about economic strategy, about economic policy strategy. What are we going to achieve? What are we going to do? And we're not able to do that. We're not able to run that discussion despite the fact that it's absolutely absurd to ask everybody to improve competitiveness. We all know it. But why are we not able to do that? Here the US could help. Here the warning shot of the Treasury was absolutely helpful in my view. It creates a discussion that was otherwise not there.
So I'm a historian, and therefore I'm a cyclicist. And so I think one thing I would say is if everything here is right, the cycle will push in a certain direction, and then there are opportunities to push back. And I think what the Tea Party has shown is that even in a political structure, as we have in the United States, that is not open to diverse points of view, even in this structure, an organized group of people a small group who feel they are not being served well by an existing system, can actually push the system in new directions. Now, I'm not advocating the Tea Party, but I think the advantage Europeans have, where they can take solace from that, is you do have a multi-party structure, and if you don't simply seek technocratic solutions, but you look to raise public awareness, and people begin to feel the effects of this as they are, I think that's an opportunity to organize. It would seem to me that in Europe, there are many people who are dissatisfied with the existing situation, and you have party vessels that can appeal to them. I think organization and raising awareness of these issues, not seeking technocratic solutions, is the way to go.
Well, one of the themes of this panel has been that you need growth and not simply ways of redistributing the pain or ameliorating the consequences. And I think there's a huge intellectual crisis facing the industrial countries and the developing countries in the world. The mid-century model of Fordism worked because productivity growth in the traded sector, in the manufacturing sector particularly, was passed on in the form of wages to very large groups of workers. It was never a majority of workers in Germany and in Britain and France. And
in Germany was a majority. In the US it was a bit different.
Yeah, the US is about 35% or so. But nevertheless, because of multiplier, once the Detroit auto workers spent their money, now in the United States, something more than 85% of workers are in the domestic non-traded service sector. And in the long run, thanks to automation, no matter how much you regain some jobs in manufacturing through onshoring, that classic model where the worker in the traded sector can share the profits that's not going to work, where most of the employees are in the non-traded domestic service sector, let's say nurses and home health aides.
Your statistics still showing high productivity gains. Statistics, huh? I don't say that I believe them. But.
Well, no, that's assuming that there's high productivity. Okay, but that was the Fordist model. The U.S. has led the world in arguing for a post-Fordist, essentially mercantilist model. It's a very strange version where you want the goals of East Asian mercantilism, permanent trade surpluses, by the means of classical liberalism, by slashing wages and by reducing public investment and so on, which is not the way the actual successful Asian economies did it. And that's kind of what is, when you hear structural reform and things like that, that's the model. That is, your success will be growing your traded sector by lowering your wages. But the problem is, if 9 out of 10 of your people in an industrial country are actually in the non-traded domestic service sector, by suppressing their wages, you just have a lot of miserable janitors and nurses. You know, this does not make you more competitive internationally. So whatever, there has to be a true third way, not what was called the third way in the 90s, but something where you get the middle class, the consuming power of the mid-20th century with the actual workforce that we have in the 21st.
So before I turn it over to the audience, I just want to make two observations about what was just said. One is that extraordinary notion that the United States is pursuing. I don't disagree with what the United States says, but it's
theory.
Right. But the wild thing about what Michael just said is that the United States runs a giant structural trade deficit, right, and pursues policies that augment it. Right, that in reality, and then we go to other countries and say, you ought to run the mercantilist program that Michael just described.
But just one more point about that.
Yeah.
I think we should drop the word competitiveness because it confuses two different things. One is productivity growth, which all countries can engage in simultaneously, and everyone on the planet is better off. The other is a relative conception.
But that's what they're talking about.
Where you're a winner, but that means saying that everyone is competitive is like saying everyone can win first prize. You can't. There have to be losers.
Right, but
the
other thing I want to
But
observe.
but you see, even this simple thing we cannot communicate in Germany. This is not possible to get it through to the top political elite in Germany that this is a nonsense, this is a fallacy of composition. It's impossible.
The other observation I'll make is just a historic one about the United States. It's frequent in U.S. political discourse for people to cite Henry Ford's raising of wages in the early 20th century, which he did during the time when the auto industry was expanding dramatically, and times were very good. What's less well known is what Henry Ford did when the demand for autos collapsed in the Depression, but which is a highly relevant anecdote for today in Europe, because what Henry Ford did when demand collapsed in the Depression was he laid everybody off, and he cut wages dramatically. And that contributed to at a time when in the United States there was no social safety net, that contributed to widespread hunger. Not unemployment and unhappiness, but hunger in Detroit. There was a march led, we don't talk about this in America, but it was actually led by the Communist Party. There was a march on Ford's headquarters in Dearborn, Michigan to demand food. And Ford's response was to have his company guards open fire with machine guns from the roof of the company headquarters. It killed, I think, 5 people and wounded about 30. That was kind of the end of the benevolent Henry Ford in Detroit. And it had some impact, not very long after that, on the construction. And here, this comes back to the point about reconstruction. It had some impact on the environment in which auto workers organized 3 years later. A piece of history that's not well known. So, questions? We have lots of questions. Let's start there. We'll take 3 and then people can respond.
Yeah, thanks. Very, very interesting. Just a point about openness and the current account, both within the transatlantic area and outside. The Eurozone is not a closed economy. And Germany has a very substantial advantage in intra-EU trade as opposed to trade outside of the European area. Moreover, the current account is a more and more a deficient indicator of external imbalance because the US, through the valuation of its assets and liabilities, manages to have a much lower indebtedness towards abroad than the current account would suggest, and the surplus in Germany is the opposite. So the surplus in Germany is smaller because of the valuation effect. What does this bring me to is that the adjustment remains a current account, a corrected current account issue for the two sides of the Atlantic. But now if you introduce the rest of the world, what you find is that the openness of the European Union is about 20%, exports plus imports over GDP. The US 16, but East Asia, which is ASEAN plus China, Korea, is 32%. So the most important area of trade has become Asia. The reason I'm mentioning this is that we are far from closed economies, both the US and the European Union or the Eurozone. And so I want to ask Flassbeck how he reacts to these facts, which I think I can document. They are actually.
Okay, I want to take two other questions. Way back in the corner there.
Yeah, it's not a question. Let me just make a couple of points and you can respond to them. First of all, the United States has had 250 years as trying to become an integrated economy. And it seems to me pretty unrealistic to expect that Europe can do that in 12 years and have the same sort of success that the United States has had of 250 years of doing that. And if you look at the U.S. economy as an example of an integrated economy, there was a terrific book and research done by a guy named James Ingram on economic integration. And he said, let's look at the 50 states. And since the United States has had so much history in integration, look at the differences in economic performance across the 50 states and set those as a standard for Europe or any other group of countries that are attempting to integrate. And part of the problem, of course, is that when the Eurozone was created out of Maastricht, there were certain rules that were established, and only one of the countries that initially entered into the Eurozone had complied with the rules that were established then. Every other country was out of bounds. And the third part is that you seem to be placing so much emphasis on the financial crisis of 2008 and the solutions to that, when that's not really the problems that's just the crisis that comes from a problem that's existed for 15 or 20 years. Europe and the United States had false growth because we had a credit bubble that existed in Europe and in the United States. The financial crisis was a reaction to the end of a credit bubble, but that credit bubble allowed for growth that was inconsistent with the structural strengths of both the United States and Europe. And what we need is solutions that recognize that what we need is structural change that allows for growth without the sort of expansionary credit that was uncalled for.
Okay,
Nobody disagrees.
I'm going to talk about this. Ford analogy was interesting, but I would argue Ford would be more like taking on massive debt to pay their workers higher wages. And if you do that, you eventually have bankruptcy. So my question is to Mr. Flassbeck. How do you expect these countries like France, Italy, Spain that raised wages significantly in pre-crisis not to cut them now? I mean, because eventually you're going to hit a national bankruptcy if you keep going down that path. And Jeremi, you could take your kids to Romania instead of Bavaria, which had 50 years of CSU rule straight.
Okay.
Okay, so in order so we can do some more questions, we'll try to respond in about 5 minutes total from the panel.
Should I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, first of all, the Eurozone open economy, what you said, well, it's a relatively closed economy. Germany, if you take Germany, you have 90%. Your export plus import gives 90% to Germany. So compare that with 20%, you see Europe is, the Eurozone is a rather closed economy. I didn't say it's a fully closed economy, but it's like Japan and like the US. And these economies have to do a different kind of economic policy. They have to look inward instead of just looking outward in terms of stimulating growth. And growth very much depends on wages and income expectations of the average household. This is the crucial lesson that we have to learn. And Insofar, the German approach of going out and beggaring their neighbors, and it's absolutely clear that they did it. I can answer the question from above at the same time. So why did wages rise in France? France did what every reasonable economy would do, namely wages would rise in real terms like productivity, exactly like productivity in France, and nominal wages would rise exactly like productivity plus the inflation target. So what's the problem with that? If that is a problem, then we can forget about market economies, forget about everything. Then nothing holds anymore. This is absolutely crucial, and was absolutely crucial inside Europe to do that. That is what Germany has done 50 years before, all the time, namely to have real wages rising in line with productivity. And Germany put a political brake on that. It was on purpose a political brake to say we go for in a different direction. We try a neoclassical experiment in wage cutting, and let's see what comes out. And what comes out is just beggar their neighbor and nothing else. All the rest did not work. And we see it in Southern Europe that it cannot work. So. And so far, that's a very simple thing. And then the financial crisis, indeed, is not the problem. Nobody said that the financial crisis is not the problem that we're discussing here. The financial crisis triggered the euro crisis. The euro crisis would have broken out anyway, but the financial crisis leads to a reassessment of risk of your assets, and then you see, oh, maybe a Greek bond is not the same as a German bond, and that is the way it triggered the crisis, but it was nothing else. And on the United States, it's an integrated economy, but there are very sophisticated investigations into the differences in unit labor costs that we have in Europe and differences in unit labor costs in the United States. And there's nothing like what we have in Europe now in the United States ever happened. Nothing like that ever happened in the United States among the states of the United States. And insofar, the level, the dimension of transfers that would be needed is much, much bigger than anything you can imagine here, even if you have an integrated fiscal policy. And as Marshall said before, it is not about institutions. This is about economic policy strategy in Europe and in its member states.
Other panelists?
Yeah, I'll just say very quickly, I think everyone agrees with your comments as well, and I think that ultimately it's all about employment. You don't want a credit-based policy. I think that's another problem that policymakers are having. They're trying to revive credit. As Jeremi Galbraith has pointed out many times, credit is a two-way contract between lender and borrower, and the banks sensibly don't want to lend when you don't have credit-worthy customers on the other side. You have rising income, you have rising employment, people can service their debts, and they can actually take on more debt to finance business expansion. The businesses can repay their loans. The banks are happy because their loans are profitable. Minsky used to say that a full employment policy was the best form of financial stability, and I strongly agree with that. And I think that's what you really want to be looking at. Getting certainly 25% unemployment is not the answer.
So I'll just say one thing as a historian about Mark's analogy to the United States. I mean, there's a lot to that, but there are two things we need to remember, right? First of all, the United States, its integration of its economy in the 19th century occurred in a protectionist environment, not a free trade environment. It's a protectionist environment. That's where the money for the union came from, right, from the tariff. The United States runs a surplus in the late 19th century without a personal income tax because of tariff income. So that's one issue. And secondly, it was also largely constructed militarily. Right? The Civil War is just one example of that. The U.S. Army was a continental force and played a key role in the expansion of the United States. So this is simply to say that one has to be careful about asking Europe to follow the same pattern as the United States. We're in a free trade environment, and most of us would not argue for protectionism. And when we hope there's not going to be a major military component to this. So the lessons only go so far, right? Historical comparison is about similarities and differences.
We can do another round. Start over here.
I think a very important issue is about labor market reform. Actually, China's labor market reform was strongly influenced by American policy. And what's the outcome? I would say it's opposite. I will supplement German perspective. If you have a lower-end manufacturer, because this technology is not advanced, mobility is very high, so if you push flexible worker mobility, you increase competitiveness, you increase market share, then you increase income. However, in the high-end technology, like Germany, if you push wage cuts, push mobility, You lost competitiveness. So in the last 30 years, you can see China rapidly expand in low-end manufacturing. But you can see large human brain flow to the United States. You can see every university, top science and engineer student from China. Why is that? Because mobility. Now China is doing all these things. Every company realize cheap labor is not the answer, but you need to recruit talents. How to recruit talents? Job stability only one side. I think another thing is to improve the environment to let the people feel you have a growth potential. So I think that in that case, France and Italy has a lot of things to do because you don't need to compete with German on heavy machinery. You cannot do these things in 10 years. German developed this for 100 years. But France and Italy has a tremendous attractiveness for Asia. So there's a high-end of consumer goods, fashion, all this type of thing. And you don't need a lower wage productivity. So I think competitiveness in a sense, if you toward diversity, everybody has a chance. But if you want to compete for convergence, you are dead. That's one issue. Second issue, I think Lin raised an important issue in geopolitics. From my observation, Japan is wrong because mainly problem for them is aging. Okay, right now you can see Japan is aging first, Europe second.
Sir, could you just try to wrap up here so we can get a couple more questions before time is up?
The problem is that if you only focus on transatlantic union, and you have aging society, how can you compete? Actually, you have no way out. So now the migration problem actually is from a young region to aging region. China has the same problem. So I think the most danger and opportunity came from Egypt. Last summer I visited.
Sir, I need to ask you to finish because otherwise there'll be no time for anyone else.
I just raised the issue. If you consider...
No, sir, I mean it, to finish now.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I think...
Sir, can you please give the microphone? Sir, can you please give the microphone to the person? Right, thank you. Thank you.
Who should I respond?
No, I want to get one more question up there.
Due to the austerity policy, we see in Europe deep adjustment of the welfare systems, and the civil society is more and more involved in the new welfare policy. Especially we have third sector development, family welfare, enterprise welfare. So my question is, do you see any convergence between the two models, American social model and the European social model? Second, labor market reform is strategic, but we don't see concrete attention in Europe on this, and we see there is a lack of mobility skills, etc. Third question, and finish. Who represents for you European Union? The old question is due that we have now an increase of multi-level decision.
Okay.
Well, to answer the first question about the Chinese model, I think that there was essentially a mythical Chinese model that animated a lot of these labor market reforms in the US and in Europe, which was that China's industrial success was primarily because of low wages, as though China were Mexico or Thailand or Mali or somewhere. The actual Chinese model was a mix of there was labor repression. There was also massive subsidy. In fact, the East Asian model, in different ways, Japan, South Korea, and so on, largely relied on direct or state or indirect channeling by government of credit towards particular export sectors. And one person in Washington who might defer to on this told me that the so-called China price for the companies he worked with was about a third wages, a third currency, and about a third subsidies. So the labor market difference actually, which was played up by people who wanted to crush unions and cut labor costs anyway, was a fairly minor model of that. And it was even more minor when you look at the inputs into Chinese exports. The Asian Development Bank did a study a couple of years ago with an earlier version of the iPhone, showing that about 3/4 of the iPhone's components came from 3 countries, Germany, Japan, and the United States, all of which had fairly high wages, and it was largely the low-wage assembly was being done in China. So if anything, that should undercut this idea that the way to become competitive in trade, not that you want to have beggar thy neighbor trade policies, but if you do, the successful beggar thy neighbor trade policies are based on credit and other things rather than lowering wages. On the question about the contemporary welfare state, I think that there is convergence on both sides of the Atlantic. It's moving away from the classic universal tax-based social insurance model towards more means-tested and privatized systems, which actually will probably consume as much as or more of the economy than the older universal social insurance systems because they're less efficient. You create an entire class of middlemen, private sector money managers and so on, who have to be paid enormous financial sector salaries in order to handle these private accounts. So you're not actually moving money from unproductive social insurance to productive investment. You're actually moving it from an efficient system to an inefficient system. Nevertheless, this is the consensus, and it's pushed constantly by lobbies in Washington, where I am. And I think one of the reasons is, frankly, it's political. The financial sector, now particularly, but as always, is looking for a source of government-guaranteed growth. And if you can compel people to steer more money into private tax-favored savings accounts, and they can simply, skim fees from it, that's this endless windfall that can go on for generations. And the other thing is, to the extent that austerity results in perpetual low growth, then if you can't find very high returning assets, like tech in the 1990s, you may settle for privatizing public utilities and public social insurance. At least it gives you a stream of steady income. And this is something that James Galbraith has described as the predator state. And I think that's the only reason I can understand why we're not talking about having fewer inefficient private programs and expanding social insurance. But instead, the whole conversation on both sides of the Atlantic, as far as I can tell, is the reverse.
I think institutions are very sticky, and practices and routines are very sticky. And even though there's a greater consciousness of a sort of a common Europe, especially in trade policy and fiscal policy, there still is a tendency to rely upon many of the state-to-state relationships that were inherited. So the British continue to have an inordinate influence on U.S. policy toward Europe and Germany, Angela Merkel. And it's not simply because of a policy judgment by Americans that these are important players. It's not a Gaullist argument per se. It's more that there are a set of routines, a set of ways of doing things that are built into the way the American bureaucracy functions. And so the consciousness and the reality are not matched up by the institutional structures. Just map out where leading American officials go and think about what are the most important meetings for American officials at a high level in their discussions about European American policy. It's something like the G8. It's not a set of EU meetings as such.
Actually, G7.
G7, excuse me, yeah, good point, G7. I agree with Michael that I think we will look back on this period and see more convergence in social welfare policies, perhaps a common race to the bottom in some elements of them. One point that hasn't been brought up, though, is I think where there's definitely convergence is in the relative greater expenditure on people toward the ends of their lives and early in their lives. And I think this is striking. The U.S. is far worse on this than most of Europe, but I think it's actually striking. It's not just the demographics, it's the way the social welfare states are set up. And I think this is a big contrast with China in some respects. I think the social welfare state is set up to not invest in the future in the ways in which we would want these social welfare states to. And I think that has to do more with the politics than it does with a set of economic judgments.
Well, I'll answer the third question. in an ideal world, if you are going to move towards more supranational structures, you would like to do it in a more democratically accountable way. Unfortunately, I think that what we've seen in the last 20 years in Europe is technocracy run amok, and that you don't actually have any kind of democratic legitimacy, and that's part of the problem. And it's you know, you can't simply impose these penalties on these countries you know, through technocratic diktats. And you know, to me, that's been the one of the manifest flaws. I think Cooney, you mentioned yesterday, they talked about the democratic deficit. I think it's a big problem, and it's going to be it's a profoundly difficult challenge, because, as the gentleman before mentioned earlier, you know, you are talking about trying to evolve political structures given thousands of years of history, culture, and the other way. So it's a profound challenge, which is why I say, you know, keep it simple, work on immediate fixes with the existing institutional arrangements you have, and you know, keep the aspirations alive. But you know, I think trying to reinvent the wheel at this point is very dangerous when the car is about to run down the cliff.
I'd like to make two remarks, one on China. China indeed started, like all the developing countries, with a low wage level. Then they attracted foreign direct investment, attracted high productivity plants to come there, and combined that to a very competitive production structure. But the important thing in Asia has got it right in comparison to Latin America and other regions. The important thing that at a certain point of time, you transform that into an economy that is based on domestic demand. And this is what has China done in the last years. If you look at the minimum wage policy, that was extremely aggressive. Minimum wages were increased by 20% year by year over a couple of years in the last years. And the average wages followed, so you have a huge increase in consumption, 7-8% in real terms every year in China now, which has induced more imports and now a dramatic reduction in the current account. This is exactly the right way to do it. We have to understand that we cannot go on with exactly the opposite policies. On the question from Italian colleague, if I got you right, the U.S. social model, formally you said, turn it this way, formally you said there is a U.S. social model which is no real social safety net, but very aggressive policies to fight recessions and to prevent unemployment. That in Europe, more relaxed economic policy, but a tighter social safety net. Nowadays, we have to learn that we cannot rely on just a social safety net, because we are abolishing it. It doesn't exist anyway in some of the poorer countries. And as I said, we need to turn for more aggressive policies in a rather closed economy. This is the lesson that we have to learn. If we don't learn it, then we'll fall back into many small open economies again.
With that, please thank the panel.